Indians of the forest. There is no present unanimous opinion as to the origin of the people found in North America by the early explorers. Scholars agree that at one time northwestern America and northeastern Asia belonged to the same cultural area. But whether the Indians came from Asia or the Asiatics from America is not yet established. For purposes of rough classification of the Indians, here, when Columbus first arrived, they were divided into three groups: Indians of the forest, Indians of the plains, and Indians of the west and southwest. Various tribes of the forest differed, but they had much in common because their mode of life was the same. The men hunted, mostly deer, and made war. Some fishing was done, and the women made attempts at agriculture. They traveled on foot and in canoe. But the forest was their home, supplying them with virtually all the worldly wants. My comment would be that I find it interesting that they did not act like they knew everything in the origin of the Indians, and were a little more willing to see possibilities that it seems later on we became closed-minded to. Indians of the plains. Vastly different were the many tribes of the interior who inhabited the Great Plains, swarming with buffalo. They likewise lived by hunting, but agriculture played a somewhat more important part in their lives. It was not until they caught and tamed the progeny of the horses that escaped from the Spanish conquerors that they secured mounts for hunting and warfare. Comment on this would be that in actuality, the first step to destroying the Plains Indians was the introduction of the horse. Because in society, as with the West originally, the people were more equal. While once the horse was involved, the men and the hunters rode on their horses above everyone else, while the women and the children moved along the ground. Even their conversations, when once heard amongst each other, had started to separate. And what destroyed the Indians was that inability to join together. Indians of the West. The tribes of the Southwest were mostly pueblos. They lived in permanent houses, often many stories high, in which each room was the home of a family. They had developed agriculture to a high degree, possessed some domesticated animals, and had mastered the science of irrigation. There were tribes of a different sort in California, while to the south dwelt the Aztecs, and beyond them was the vanished cultures of the Mayans. Despite his savagery, the Indian was possessed of much dignity and simple wisdom, bred in him by the vast areas of virgin lands, which were his home and his heritage. Well, main part on this one I would have to comment on was that the recognition at this point, which was lost later, that the Indian was possessed of much dignity and simple wisdom, bred in him by the vast areas of virgin lands, which were his home and heritage, not ours. Leif Erikson discovers Vinland. Many scholars claim that the hardy Viking Leif Erikson discovered America, son of Eric the Red, who colonized Greenland. Leif, in about the year 1000, landed on a coast which he called Vinland. For some of his men had seen wild grapes growing. This was probably either Nova Scotia or New England of later times. Such was the shadowy prologue. It was to be an almost 500 years before the real drama of American history began. In comment, I guess, was apparently the real drama of American history beginning was the invasion of the Europeans. I guess we did bring the drama. As the 15th century drew to a close, the world was ready for the real discovery of America. Some people were saying that the world was round, and had asserted that it might be possible to reach the riches of the East by sailing west. It was assumed that the same ocean washed the coasts of China and Europe. The increasing restlessness found its man of honor in Christopher Columbus. He had unshakable faith and an idea that was willing to risk his life for it. He said he would reach the Orient by sailing into the Atlantic. For 10 years, he haunted the courts of Europe, seeking a financial backer. At length, the necessary money was borrowed on security offered by the Queen of Spain. That she offered her jewel for the purpose may only be legend. Orders were issued to outfit Columbus with 3 tiny ships, and after great difficulties in securing crews, he set sail from Palos on August 3rd, 1492. A stop was made at the Canary Islands. Columbus kept 2 logbooks, one for himself and one to show his doubting crew. In early October, the men began to grumble openly. Some suggested throwing Columbus overboard, but the faith of the commander prevailed. On the evening of October 11th, lights were seen, and the next day Columbus stepped ashore in the New World on a small island in the Bahamas, probably that which is now known as Watling. The natives told him by signs of a country to the south. Toward it he sailed and found Cuba, but he was convinced that he had found the mainland of India. He then skirted Haiti, left half his men to plant a colony, and returned to Europe. England's early claims to America had little to do with any exploration by her own citizens. John Cabot, born in Genoa and a citizen of Venice, induced Henry VIII to outfit an expedition. In 1497 and 1498, Cabot, probably accompanied by his son Sebastian, explored the coast from Newfoundland to South Carolina. But England forgot the work of the Cabots until a century later, when she was only too anxious to recall their discoveries. A Portuguese navigator succeeded where Columbus had failed. In 1497, da Gama set out to discover the mysterious empire to the east. Heading into the South Atlantic and then turning east, he sighted the African coast near the Cape of Good Hope. In the discovery of which he had, however, been anticipated by Diaz. Rounding that land's end, he continued east, and so at last was found the water route to India. He claimed the country and returned home in triumph. This picture was made in 1747. Amerigo Vespucci survived in history because from him derived the names of 2 continents. He accompanied an expedition to South America in 1499. Years later, there was published his accounts of this trip, in which he told the wondrous sights he had seen, giving the impression that he was in command of the vessel and that his journey antedated the third made by Columbus. Waldemar Muller, a geographer, having Vespucian's account and not that of Columbus's, accepted the former story, and in 1507 called the new continent America, after the author's first name. To the Spaniards in the West Indies, the natives brought tales of a great land in which there was a spring having the power to confer perpetual youth. In 1513, Ponce de Leon set out to find these magic waters and discovered the mainland near St. Augustine. He named the country Florida, sailed down the east coast of the peninsula, partway up the west, and returned through the previously unknown Bahama Channel, a protected strip of water which was later to be the haunt of pirates. Balboa fled from his home in San Domingo, pursued by debt, and seized the rule of a struggling colony in Darien. From there, he journeyed overland to prove the truth of Indian reports to a vast ocean to the west. Coming to a ridge, he made his companions remain behind, and reaching the summit first, discovered the mighty Pacific. When he had made the long journey to the shore, he plunged into the water, claiming on September 29th, 1513, all the oceans in the name of the King of Spain. Magellan, an expatriated Portuguese, whose expedition was the first to circle the earth, sailed from Spain in 1519. He discovered the tortuous passage around the tip of South America and eventually came out on the waters first seen by Balboa. He named the ocean Pacific because of its gentle breezes. Reaching the Philippines after suffering great hardships, he died. Sebastian de Cano continued the voyage, eventually bringing to Spain with great news that at last, East had been reached by the sailing West. Hernando Cortez left Cuba in 1519 to conquer Mexico. Reaching the mainland, his boats became worm-eaten and sank. Some say he burned them purposely. At any rate, with his escape cut off, it was a question of win or perish. Finding his way to the capital, he captured Montezuma, butchered the natives, and helped himself to a vast wealth of gold and silver. His brilliant campaigns made many at home jealous, and he was forced to return to Spain. He made another voyage, and on returning from it, was received coldly by the king. Perhaps there was truth to the bitter taunts that he had given his sovereign more province than his ancestors had, bequeathed him cities. One of the victims of the reputed wealth of the Floridas was Hernando de Soto, who had had his appetite for gold whetted by his fortune. He had accompanying Pizarro to Peru. He sold part of his property, outfitted an expedition, and landed in Florida in 1539. The next 4 years he spent marching through the southern state, ever seeking for gold, until in 1541 he came to the Mississippi. He crossed the river and explored the present states of Arkansas and Louisiana. As the party was returning in 1542 along the Mississippi, De Soto died, and his men hurried him to the waters of the great river he had discovered. Although he had dissipated his fortune in a vain quest for riches, he accomplished a far worthier result in opening a vast territory to those who followed. led on by tales of 7 cities to the north, each one as rich as the great ones in Mexico, found by Cortez, Francisco de Coronado, with a large expedition, turned northward from New Spain in 1540. He explored our southwest. He found Indians living in pueblos and saw buffalo, but no gold, and returned home. In 30 years, the Spaniards, seeking wealth, had opened up Mexico and the southern and southwestern United States for the real work of colonization. Sir Walter Raleigh was the first man to visualize America as a place in which Englishmen might find homes, not wealth. He attempted to have Virginia colonized in 1584, again in 1585, and for the third time in 1587. This later expedition was led by John White, an incompetent whose choice of the poor soil of Roanoke on which to settle, he saw the colony launched and then hurried back to England for supplies for the new settlers. When White left, the remaining colonists promised that if they moved away, they would leave behind them the name of their destination. In 1591, when he returned, the word Croatoan, the name of a tribe of Indians, was found in a tree. The colonists had vanished. Years later, settlers learned that they had gone to the Indians. If any escaped massacre, they were doubtlessly absorbed into one of the Indian tribes, and traditions to this effect has continued throughout the centuries. So ended the attempt to settle a colony in America. In 1606, a better organized attempt was made to settle Virginia by the London Company. Advantage was taken by the mistakes at Roanoke, and a landing was made at Jamestown in 1607. The colony's sponsors in England decreed that it be ruled by a board of 7 men, and the sealed document embodied this decree was opened just before landing. But it was so impossible type of government, and Edward Wingfield, one of the 7, soon was chosen president. The pictures shown the arrival of the new ship from England, bringing of supplies and new settlers to this struggling colony. A new colony did not prosper. All profits from the venture were to go to the sponsors, the London Company. And so the powerful, impetuous, and private gains was absent. Moreover, some settlers had little desire for work and were inclined to sit by while indentured servants performed the manual labor. Disease, idleness, and incompetence very nearly extinguished in its first years this fourth attempt by Englishmen to settle America. In his energy and resourcefulness, John Smith soon displaced Wingfield and became the acknowledged leader of Jamestown. On one of his expeditions to the Indians to barter for food, Smith was captured. According to a tale told by Smith many years later, he was saved from death only when Pocahontas, daughter of the powerful chief Powhatan, begged for his life. Smith advanced the colony, but when he sailed for England, things sank back again. In the winter of 1609 to 1610 was known as the Starving Time. Although some doubt had been cast on the story of Pocahontas and John Smith, it is certain that this attractive Indian maiden was first convert of her people to Christianity. She married John Rolfe, one of the early settlers, not John Smith. Many families still prominent in Virginia trace their ancestry to this marriage, including that of the Boylings. One member of which was the second wife of President Woodrow Wilson. It was Sir Thomas Dale, a harsh tyrant, who eventually set Jamestown on a permanent foundation. He forced their idle work and ruthlessly killed those who shirked it. In 1622, the Indians seeking to protect their land slaughtered 400 settlers, and in 1644, 300 more. In later years, a system of great estates, so characteristic to the South, was to come into being, based on slave labor, the growing of tobacco, and still later, the growing of cotton. The colony grew rapidly, and by 1630, the colony grew rapidly, and by 1650 held more than 15,000 inhabitants. The long and prosperous tenure of Sir William Berkeley, although a proud and arrogant governor, had much to do with the changed conditions. One of his wisest decisions was to surrender peaceably in March 1652 to a fleet sent over by Parliament. By this, he not only saved bloodshed, but also many of Virginians' charter rights. In 1675, the colony was again menaced by Indian raids, and the settlers on the borders came to Berkeley asking aid. He refused it, and soon the people began to raise troops under Nathaniel Bacon. To Berkeley, this was treason. Bacon turned against him. He seized and burned Jamestown. On Bacon's death from fever, the revolution collapsed, but it had shown how Virginians felt towards arbitrarily emissaries from the king, and it was an omen of 1776. The Pilgrims, separatists from the Church of England, first went to Holland in their search for a place where they might worship according to their beliefs. But after 10 years in that country, finding that their children had grown up to be more Dutch than English and not having prospered financially, they determined to settle in America. 102 of them sailed in the Mayflower in 1620. Before landing, they signed the famous Mayflower Charter, which looked forward to establishment of a democratic form of government for the colony. The Mayflower's objective was Virginia, but sighting Cape Cod, the Pilgrims chose, after weeks of exploration, the present site of Plymouth for their home. On December 26th, they came ashore. They were almost as poorly equipped to fight the wilderness as were the Virginians. Their religion was an absolute faith in the literal teachings of the Bible. Together, they were plain speech, plain clothes, and modest bearing, were, however, not unsuited to the trials ahead. When the Mayflower sailed away, the last tie with home was cut. Massachusetts winter had set in, and food was scarce. By spring, 14 of the 18 wives who had sailed in the ship had died. When a good crop was eventually harvested, a Thanksgiving Day was set aside to commemorate it. Governor Bradford's good sense in dealing with the Indians and in abolishing communal labor had much to do with saving the colony. The colony at Plymouth, after the first few years, took on a semblance of permanence. Education was beginning, and of course attendance at church was the accepted thing. The Pilgrims were, however, far less militant in their religion than the Puritans, who in 1629 and 1630 settled the larger colony of Massachusetts Bay. They arrived in force at Salem, then Boston, and finally settled 7 other towns. They were recruited from the businessmen of England and brought with them the instinct for trade to the New World. As the colonies expanded, trouble with the Indians was inevitable. In 1637, stirred by a common enemy, the whites joined against the Pequots in an intercolonial war managed by the Massachusetts colony and the Connecticut towns. John Mason and John Underhill were the leaders. The Indians were cornered. Of some 400 men, women, and children, only 4 escaped alive. The Pequots tribe was extinguished by this and a subsequent bloody slaughter, which, although cruel, gained peace for the colony for many years. Miles Standish's gruff character as a soldier has lent credence to Longfellow's story of his courtship of the pretty Priscilla Mullins. It is a popular legend that the bashful Standish sent John Alden to court Priscilla for him, and that she, knowing Alden's heart, was not in his mission, suggested that he speak for himself. Alden did marry her. However, he lived to be the only surviving member of the original Mayflower Company. Puritanism in American life and letters had become a symbol of restraint. It placed a curb on the boisterous expressionism of natural good spirits and was for many years a restraining influence on the social life of New England. Of great influence were the divines John Cotton and Increase Mathers. After their decline, there was a lull until the fiery Jonathan Edwards stirred for the last time the dying embers of religious and semi-religious frenzy. It must be remembered that the Puritans came to America not to set up a colony for free worship, but to set up a home where they might have worship as they chose. A corollary of this was their readiness to impose their ideas on others, and against Thomas Morton, a carefree adventurer, they discovered a dual reason for taking action. He was their rival in the profitable fur trade, and soon felt the force of their religious arms. One day, they appeared at his settlement and tore down his gay maypole, put an end to his revels, and banished him to England. Roger Williams was another to fall afoul of the Massachusetts authorities. He was banished because, among other things, he maintained that to acquire lands legally, the colonists must buy it from the Indians. Escaping from Massachusetts, he founded Providence in 1636, the first colony of which religious toleration became a reality. He made friends with the savages, and through his friendship rendered valuable service to his late oppressors during their war with the Pequots. One of the most forceful personalities among the Puritans was John Endicott. Rash, bigoted, and brave, he it was who first purchased from the Plymouth Company several miles of Massachusetts coast, extending westward to the Pacific, and settled Salem. He was both a leader in the Pequot War and one of the chief persecutors of the Quakers. One of his exploits was the cutting of the cross from the king's ensign. Even this symbolism being contrary to his own scriptures. The Puritans could not stem the rising tide of liberal thought in the colonies, but they tried. First, Mrs. Anna Hutchinson, a lady of fine birth, was banished for expressing her religious conviction, and the subsequent slaughter of her entire family by the Indians was considered a judgment of God. Next, they turned on the Quakers, even putting some of them to death. Massachusetts was unique in the lengths to which it went in these persecutions. The darkest blots on early New England history are the witchcraft killings in Salem of 1691 and 1692. In all, about 30 people, mostly friendless old men and women, were put to death, one by the horrible method of crushing with heavy weights. The evidence, which was presented in court by those who claimed they had been bewitched, made a mockery of English justice. The craze finally collapsed as suddenly as it had started. Education was a primary concern of the New Englanders. In 1649, a law was passed requiring every town of more than 50 families to support a school. Meanwhile, in 1636, Harvard College, the only center of highest learning for half a century, had been founded. The view of early Harvard was engraved by Paul Revere, whose thrifty soul cut off during the Revolution the missing half of the plate that he might use the copper to engrave banknotes. It was natural that with a colony started in Massachusetts, the English would spread to the rest of what they called New England. The Dutch were in what is now Connecticut. Before them, however, having planted a settlement at the present site of Hartford, in or previous to 1633. The two were soon in conflict, and quarrels were not uncommon. Temporary peace was established in 1650. The government established to the south differed in one important respect to that of Massachusetts, in that there was no religious test for citizenship. In the century and a half from the actual colonization of the New World to the outbreak of the Revolution, America passed through the first stage of her industrial development. The first settlers and his wife had of necessity to make most of what they needed with their own hands. Gradually, as the social systems crystallized and money began to circulate, they grew up a place for the skilled artisan. By the middle of the 18th century, a high degree of commercial self-sufficiency had been attained. Although labor-saving devices, machinery, were beginning to make an appearance in England about 1790, it was not until after the War of 1812 that Americans made the first step from artisan labor to factory system. There is no certainty as to who first discovered the coast of Maine. In 1605, however, George Weymouth was sent to North Virginia to maintain English claim of prior possession. He journeyed up the Kennebec River, the shores of which entranced him with their virgin beauty. Unfortunately, the later settlers, and for their victims, he kidnapped several Indians whom he took back to England. At about the same time that Virginia was being settled, the Dutch began moving into the area dominated by the Hudson River. They sent Hudson in 1608 to discover the Northwest Passage to China. This was much the same objective that led on the great company of the early explorers a century and more beforehand. Hudson failed to find the passage, and churning south at last entered New York Bay. In 1609, he sailed up the mighty river, named after him, to what is now Albany, and a small boat was sent even further. Hudson's discoveries proved that the river did not lead to China, that there was no isthmus in North America, as there was at Panama, and led directly to Dutch colonization. Hudson's exploration revealed the value of the river valley. The first houses on the Manhattan sprang up around a trading post on the southern tip, established by the Dutch. In 1621, New Netherland was put under the newly chartered Dutch West Indian Company, which sent out directors to govern it. In 1623 or 1624, about 30 Walloon families arrived, but all but 8 of the men of the company continued up the river to settle Fort Orange, now Albany. In 1629, Peter Minuit negotiated a famous purchase of Manhattan Island for cloth, beads, and other trinkets to a total value of about $25. The Dutch later made an attempt to transplant the patroon system to the region dominated by the Upper Hudson. But feudalism in any form was unsuited to the wilderness. Although the number of colonists increased slowly, the town gradually assumed a prosperous, even a wealthy air. The comfortable life of the traders of this era shaped its social and economic structure for many years after Dutch rule disappeared. When Peter Minuit retired, troublous times came to the colony. Governor Van Twiller met opposition to Dutch expansion in Connecticut and along the Delaware. His successor, William Kieft, arrived in 1638, found himself faced with the necessity of arousing a sluggish population to fight the Indians. To continue the war, he imported John Underhill, one of the leaders in the Para War slaughter, from New England, and peace eventually was made in 1646. Kieft finally gave way willingly to Peter Stuyvesant, last and greatest of the Dutch governors. Stuyvesant was stubborn, brave, hard-hearted, and possessed of a violent temper, but withal a good governor. He did more to improve the physical condition of the city than any of his predecessors. The English, who had never given him up claim to all the Atlantic coast, decided in 1664 it was time to eliminate the Dutch. A fleet appeared in the harbor, and Stuyvesant pegged up and down in his wooden leg, vowing he would fight. But the city was defenseless, and people were opposed to him, and he was finally led forcibly by them from the ramparts without a gun being fired. The Atlantic seacoast from Maine to Florida was now in English hands. With the fall of New Amsterdam, New Jersey was granted to the Duke of York, and that same year he conveyed it to Lord John Berkeley and Sir George Carteret. Berkeley sold his interest to 2 Quakers. Later, one of these 2 disposed of his share to 3 Quakers, one of whom was William Penn. Later still, the 3 acquired the share of the other Quakers. The 4-way deed of 1676 gave Carteret East Jersey and the Quakers West Jersey. Carteret's land was put on the auction block in 1682, and Penn and 11 associates bought it for £3,400. The 12 were later doubled in numbers, and in 1701, 1702, all the proprietors surrendered their rights of jurisdiction. In settlement of a debt owed to his father, Charles II gave William Penn a grant of land in the New World. In 1682, the young Quaker, fired with the idea of governmental and religious freedom, sailed up the quiet waters of the Delaware to take possession of his grant. The name Pennsylvania, in this Latinized from the form of Penn's Woods. Almost Penn's first act was to make a treaty with the Indians, and his next was to establish for his colony a liberal form of self-government. At the confluence of the Schuylkill and the Delaware River, Penn established Philadelphia, the town of brotherly love, laying out an architectural plan of rectangular divisions bounded by broad, straight roads or streets, a design which was one of the earliest city planning projects that later served as a model for many other cities throughout the world. All men who professed faith in Christ were invited to come there. English, Welsh, and Germans flocked to the new colony, and so rapid was the growth of Penn's green country town that it soon surpassed the older settlements of Boston and New York, becoming the foremost commercial center of the colonial Americas. Franklin and Philadelphia, it was the happy marriage of our early history, and the story of the arrival in the city as a poor boy with a loaf of bread under his arm is a true American legend. The secret of his success was his rare common sense and ability to make others see a plain fact plainly arrived at. He was a printer and publisher, an inventor, a scientist, a philosopher, a public-spirited citizen, and a statesman. Before he died, he was hailed as the wise man of the new nation. Although the French and Indian Wars upset the borders, life in and around Philadelphia continued peaceful and prosperous up to the Revolution, in comparison with the disturbances in the other colonies. Despite quarrels from Penn's heirs, relations with the proprietors in England were fairly amiable. The city's landmark was the State House, later Independence Hall, built between 1731 and 1751. In the additions to it, built around 1791, sat the Supreme Court and the Congress. The Dutch colony established by Dr. David Verhuijs in Delaware was destroyed by the Indians in 1632. Dr. Verhuijs wrote that he found only the skulls and the bones of our people. Other Dutch settlements followed, and a conflict with the Swedes, who had also settled in Delaware Bay, ensued. Peter Stuyvesant conquered the settlement of New Sweden, but in 1664, when New Netherland fell, Delaware also became English. Although the colony had an independent legislature, it was governed by the Chief Executive of Pennsylvania under the Duke of York's grant to Penn, down in 1776. Maryland, by reason of Baltimore's grant, did not release claim to all of Delaware until 1767, when the present dividing line between the two states was laid down. George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore, obtained from James I a grant of lands near the James River, where he thought he and other Catholics might find a haven of peace. The actual grant was issued by his son, Cecilius Calvert, in June 1632. The Charter of Maryland contained the patents to the Lord Baltimore, then and in future, was noteworthy in its guarantees of freedom of government, even freedom from taxation by the crown, freedom of religion. Cecilius delegates command of the expedition to his younger brother, Leonard Calvert. He was accompanied by two Jesuit priests, Father Andrew White and Father John Altham, and in about 300 emigrants. They sailed on November 22nd, 1633, in two ships, the Ark and the Dove, and landed in Maryland, which was named after the Queen, on March 25th, 1634, the day of Annunciation of the Most Holy Virgin Mary. They planted the great cross of wood and knelt around it while the litany was read. Although some colonists had filtered southward from Virginia, the settlements of the regions between that colony and Florida was placed by the king in the hands of 8 of his friends, who became proprietors. Two regions developed, bearing the names North Carolina and South Carolina, the latter with important West India connections, the investment of greater capital, and the cultivation of rice and indigo on plantation worked by Negro slaves, became the richer and more aristocratic North Carolina was relatively poor and democratic. Both passed safely through the dangerous Indian Wars after much disorder. Both colonies became royal colonies where the proprietors sold their rights to the crown. James Oglethorpe, moved by the wretched conditions of the prisoners in England's debtors' prisons, secured permission to start a colony in Georgia in 1733. There was also in view the idea of making the colony in line of frontier defense against the Spaniards in the south. This was the last unsettled land between Maine and Florida. Oglethorpe made peace with the Indians, forbade the introduction of slaves and rum, and limited the land's holdings to each settler. These restrictions did not attract new colonists, and prosperity was slow in coming until they were relaxed in 1749. Spain had never given up her claim on the southern coast, and much of the time up to 1748, when the dispute was settled, was consumed with beating back the ambitious Spaniards. Although the Spaniards were the first to explore Florida, they were slow to settle it. In 1564, de Laudonnière, the Huguenot leader, established at Fort Caroline a French settlement. The Spaniards realized that if their returning treasure ships were to be safe, the land could not remain in the enemy hands. Pedro Menendez was sent to rout the French. He not only routed them, but butchered those who surrendered. Leaving a garrison at Fort Caroline, Menendez founded St. Augustine in 1565, first permanent settlement in America. It had been said, though, without satisfactory proof, that the French were not slow in dealing with their enemies. Dominic de Gourgos, suddenly appearing at Fort Caroline, killed all who resisted and hanged the prisoners. If this actually happened, it was an act of useless cruelty, for the French made no further attempts to expand there, and Florida remained Spanish until it was purchased by the United States in 1819. So long as Spain controlled the sea routes, her treasure ships returning from the New World were relatively safe. But when the Spanish Armada was defeated, the pirates, English, Dutch, French, began to intercept the streaming of returning treasures. These picturesque murderers and highwaymen of the sea came from all stations of life. They flourished in the 16th century, and on one occasion a pirate fleet is said to have captured at Vera Cruz a booty worth 30 million. Giovanni de Verrazzano, an Italian, was the first to establish any French claim to the New World. He was sent out by Francis I in 1524 to find a route to China by way of the Western waterways. Touching at about Cape Fear on the present coast of North Carolina, he sailed north and discovered Hudson River, and may have found the present Narragansett Bay, Newport Harbor, and even the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The voyages of Jacques Cartier were the real basis of the French claims to Canada. In 1534, he set out to find the passage to China that had evaded so many others. That year and the next explored the St. Lawrence as far as Montreal, where he visited the Indian village of Hochelaga. Aside from one abortive effort at Quebec in 1541, no serious effort to colonize was made until the coming of Champlain. Samuel de Champlain established Quebec in 1608. Appreciating that that site was the key to the St. Lawrence River Valley, he explored much of the country and made frequent trips to France to advance Quebec's interest. He was forced to surrender his beloved city to the English and the Iroquois in 1629, but when Canada was restored to the French hands, he came back to his post. His wife, whom he had married when he was but 12, became a nun on his death in 1635. One unwitting act of Champlain's lost the French all chance of expanding southward. He accompanied the Algonquin in a war party against the Iroquois in 1609. Two being shot by him, the Iroquois fled, and the Algonquin roared with laughter at seeing the enemy so easily routed. But the French were henceforth to find the powerful Iroquois unalterable, opposed to them in New York. On this trip, Champlain discovered the lake named after him, and in 1615 became the first white man to see the Great Lakes. The arrival of the Jesuits gave impetus to expansion in New France. These fine men came to convert the Indians and to advance the fur trade for their country. They were successful with the Algonquin and the Hurons, but the Iroquois were implacable. Many of these French missionaries were killed, including Brebeuf, after excruciating torture. Following the Jesuits came the Ursulines, a teaching order, and the Hospitalians, or nurses. The Recollets were present before the Jesuits, but their 10 years of missionary work convinced them that a richer, better organized group was needed to carry on.
Champlain was followed by Nicolet, who explored westward to Lake Michigan. At one point in his journey, Nicolet, thinking he neared China, dressed himself in ceremonial robes. A quarter century later, Radisson and Groseillers followed him and explored Lake Superior. Later, transferring their allegiance for a while to England, they were instrumental in establishing the Hudson Bay Company's lucrative fur trade. The age of expansion, in which France claimed by right of original exploration all territory from Hudson Bay to the Gulf and west to the Rockies, had begun. If France failed to win all America except the coastal fringe of English colonies, was in the end due to two factors. Too few settlers came to her settlements, and French sea power, the only method of communication with the New France, was surpassed by the British. Two noted explorers of the Golden Age of exploration were Father Marquette, a Jesuit, and Joliet, a trader. They pushed beyond Lake Erie, descended the Mississippi to Arkansas in 1673, and then turned back, fearing that the news of their great discoveries would perish with them at the hands of the Spaniards. La Salle completed Marquette's work. Although undoubtedly a visionary, he was the first to grasp the magnificent idea of a great French empire in the interior of the Americas. In the time of the Great Frontenac, the finest governor New France ever enjoyed, La Salle headed for the Mississippi, which he appreciated was the key to the imaginary empire. He reached the Gulf in 1682, and being assured by the Indians that he was the first white man to explore the river, claimed its valley for the King of France. The next year, La Salle was in France. His plan was to settle Louisiana, and an expedition was fitted out for him. But his ships, missing the Delta, took him far to the west of Mississippi. He spent the last months of 1685 in Texas, vainly searching for his beloved river. He finally gave up in 1687 and turned north. His men were grumbling at the rigorous manner in which he ruled them, and finally one of the company killed him by shooting him in the back. Count Frontenac, a vigorous soldier, was France's opening gun in the battle for North America. Louis XIV sent him back to Canada as governor in 1689. For trouble with the English, King William's War, was just beginning. He carried out a series of bloody raids in New York, New Hampshire, and Maine. An expedition sent against him at Quebec in 1690 was a disastrous failure. Nevertheless, the war dragged on for 7 years. Neither side gained appreciably in the first trials of the arms. It was the prelude to the struggle, which was to continue for 3/4 of a century. The Sal's work was completed by d'Iberville and Bienville. The former planted in 1699 the first trading post in Mississippi, and the later founded New Orleans in 1718. Both places had enormous possibilities which were never realized, although Cadillac was to found Detroit in 1701 and lay Verendier's sons possibly to see the Rockies in 1743. The great age of the French exploration was over. Wars with the English and Indians to the north put an end to the dream of French empire on the Mississippi.
The period which witnessed the decline of the Spanish power in Europe saw the steady growth of her influence in southwestern America. Explorers and missionaries pushed their way into Lower California and then into California itself. An expedition under Don Gaspar de Portola left San Diego in July 1769, and a few months later emerged from the forest to see stretched below the great harbor of San Francisco Bay and the rock pillars of the Golden Gate. Two basic conflicts were inherent in our colonial life, one between the settlers and the Indians. Wars similar to that with the Iroquois ravaged virtually all the colonies, and another between the English and the French. Both conflicts continued up to the eve of the Revolution. The French held Canada, including the St. Lawrence and the Mississippi. They wanted the Hudson. The English wanted to push west, where outposts of the two touched only warfare could settle the issue. Philip, a Wampanoag, began the war that bears his name in 1675. The struggle was marked by ruthless slaughter on both sides, with complete annihilation of the enemy, the one objective. Eventually, superior organized of the whites turned the balance, although King Philip was killed in 1676. The struggle dragged on. During the fight, the whites suffered serious losses of men, the great destruction of their crops and homes, but as a result, the Indian menace in the southern New England was removed. Philip's war was no sooner over than another danger appeared. Charles II and James I intended to revoke the charter rights of the colonies and make them royal provinces. Connecticut, alarmed, hid her charter in an oak tree, but even she submitted when Edmund Andros arrived in 1688. As the royal governor, his harsh rule, carried on in defiance of charter rights, although it was a short one. For when James was overthrown in England, the people rose and put Andros in jail. With King William's War from 1690 to 1697 began the serious conflicts with the French. It was following of Queen Anne's War from 1701 to 1713, and King George's War 1744 to 1748. In the first, neither side gained. In the second, the English won Acadia, also known as Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Hudson Bay. In the third, William Pepperell captured the powerful fortress of Louisbourg, only to lose it under the unwise terms of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. These three wars were the prelude to the last act of the drama, in which the curtain was to be forever rung down on the epic of French Empire in the New World. The last act of drama of the struggle for North America, the French and Indian War, was begun in 1754, with each side preparing to fight to a decision. As a first move, the English sent General Braddock in 1755 against Fort Duquesne. Near there, his expedition was ambushed. His Virginia troops fought, as did the Indians, from behind trees, but Braddock forced his regulars into solid files where they were excellent marks for the concealed enemy. He himself was wounded, and about half his forces was killed. George Washington, already winning fame as a brilliant commander, played a brave part in the retreat. The English now decided to make a solid their hold on Nova Scotia, and the expulsion of the Acadians was agreed on. It is doubtful whether these farming people were a real menace, but the English thought they were, and assembling them in their village churches, read them the decree of expulsion. They were forced onto ships and scattered heartlessly throughout the colonies. Longfellow was told a romantic story of this unnecessary brutality in Evangeline. The year was 1657, brought a serious English disaster. Fort William Henry had remained in English hands until that year, when its garrisons marched out before Montcalm, the last great man in New France. Then the tragedy occurred. Montcalm could not restrain the bloodlust of his Indian allies, who set on the defenseless men. The French generals risked his life to halt the slaughter, but at least 50 were tomahawked before his troops put an end to it all. The pace now quickened, for Pitt was in the saddle in England, determined to force the affairs at long last to a conclusion. A terrific bombardment forced his heroic defenders of Louisbourg to surrender at Lord Jeffreys Amherst in 1758 in New York. Despite the catastrophe at Ticonderoga, Fort Frontenac was taken, and the same year Fort Duquesne was abandoned by the French to an expedition headed by John Forbes, in which Washington had a subordinate command. It was the beginning of the end, for both wings of the French dominions had begun to crumble, one of the Atlantic and the other on the Great Lakes. At last, the way was clear for the real objective of all this warfare, Quebec. Against it by sea came the greatest war fleet to cross the Atlantic up to 1917. Against it, by land, came 8,000 troops under General Wolfe. Montcalm, deserted by the government in Paris and harried by intrigue and corruption within the walls of Quebec, prepared to resist. Wolfe determined to make a decisive attack by land, and on September 13, 1759, he fought the brilliantly conceived Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Both he and Montcalm fell, but Quebec was in British hands at last. Unparalleled scenes of celebration took place in London and the colonies. The next year, Montreal fell, and France laid down her arms. In the New World forever, the dream was over. Because the French were defeated, all was not yet safe for the ever-expanding English. Pontiac, as able an Indian as has ever lived, united the jealous tribes for one final effort in 1763. Had he lived 100 years earlier, he might have succeeded. He led his followers to many victories, but the end was never in doubt. Pontiac died at the hands of one of his own race who, for a barrel of rum, struck him down from behind. Pontiac's war showed London that the menace of the frontier remained. 10,000 troops were accordingly kept in the colonies, and it was planned to support them in part by the proceeds from the stamp tax, resistance to which was one of the links in the chain of events leading to the Revolution. After an effort at a further taxation in 1767, designed to recognize the distinction between external and internal taxes, all these duties were repealed in the 1770s, except for the tax on tea. 3 years later, Parliament passed another law which permitted the East India Company to export part of the tea stored in its warehouses free from all English duties, but subject to the tax levied for the American ports. Part of this tea was about to be landed in Boston when, on the night of December 16th, a crowd of men dressed as Indians boarded a British ship and dumped its cargo of tea into the harbor. No tax tea was wanted in Boston. The rising tide of opposition to British rule finally brought about that which had never before been possible: sustained unity of action against the colonies. Hitherto, local jealousies and conflicting interests had kept them apart. Now the rights of all were menaced. Virginia sent out the call for delegates to attend a Continental Congress. Philadelphia was chosen as the meeting place. September 5th, 1774, representatives of all but Georgia began sessions in Carpenter's Hall. The ablest leaders in America attended. A radical party, not yet daring to broach independence, and a conservative element for allegiance to the king soon materialized. Despite this difference, resolves were passed in which the colonies claimed the right to legislate for their own affairs, and the right inherent in personal and political liberty. Finally, a compact was made not to import from or export to Great Britain. After certain dates, with this, the Congress, which had served chiefly to unite the Whigs, adjourned. In the spring of 1775, Gage determined to break the gathering storm and dispatched troops to Concord, 18 miles from Boston, to seize a supply of colonists' military goods. Paul Revere warned of this decision by the prearranged signal. A lantern hung in the North Church rode through the night, warning the farmers and the Minutemen, a body of militia formed but a few weeks before, of the coming British. He reached Lexington in time, but was captured before he came to Concord. In addition to the stores at Concord, the object of the British was the arrest of the radicals of Samuel Adams and John Hancock. When the columns arrived at Lexington shortly after dawn on April 19th, about 100 militia opposed them. There was a shot, then a volley, and the colonists fled, leaving 8 dead. The British lost not a man. The military significance of Lexington was infinitesimal. Its political significance was, and still is, stupendous. After Lexington, the British pushed on to Concord, and covering the bridge made a gesture at destroying the colonial stores. Those at the bridge were soon attacked by an overwhelming number of militia. The whole body was being forced to retreat to Boston. The shot heard around the world had been fired, and the revolution had begun. During the retreat, the redcoats of the British made easy marks for the American sharpshooters from farmhouse windows and from behind the fences and trees. The finest British troops have been surrounded, ambushed, and outflanked. The wonder is that they escaped complete capture. On June 16th, the Americans forfeited Bunker and Breed's Hills overlooking Boston. Gage's besieged position in the city was now more than ever insecure. His troops attacked the next day, but were twice driven back by the defenders, who withheld their fire until you see the whites in their eyes. Such was the practice of good frontiers marksmen. On the third charge of the Americans, their ammunition exhausted, retired, and in the end, the British carried the hill, but the moral effect of the strong American defense against the able and well-trained troops was great. War was now on in earnest, and the army needed a general. Congress appointed General Washington, a gentleman from Virginia, and a soldier trained in the Indian Wars, to that position. And what had been a New England army became a continental one. From that moment that he took command in Cambridge, Washington, never had a full quota of troops, was continually hampered by desertion and discontent. It was his patience, his firm hand, and his confidence and respect he inspired in men universally, as much as his ability as a commander, for which the war was to a successful conclusion 6 years later. Now came one of those incidents that made the history of the Revolution so colorful. Ethan Allen of Vermont, on his own initiative, raised the Green Mountain Boys and proceeded against Ticonderoga. He surprised the garrison and took the fort in the name of God and the Continental Congress. The supply of guns, ammunition, heavy cannons, which he captured, were desperately needed at Cambridge, especially the cannon which he later played a part in the taking of Boston. Now came Benedict Arnold's daring march to Canada, which, although in the end was a failure, came astonishingly near success. Its real objective was the winning of the Canadians to the American cause. Washington gave his full approval. Suffering incredible hardships, Arnold marched his men north through the approaching winter of 1775. Another column under Montgomery joined him after taking Montreal. Their joint attack on Quebec was a failure. Montgomery was killed and Arnold retreated to Crown Point, contesting every foot of the way. While the British remained besieging in Boston, in the spring of 1776, Washington determined to bring the matter to a head. In a surprise move, he took Dorchester Heights. After that, the city was at the mercy of the cannon captured at Ticonderoga. Lord Howe embarked his 11,000 soldiers together with the Loyalist inhabitants and sailed for Halifax. He left behind him a prodigious amount of supplies and military stores which Washington greatly needed. After Boston, Washington marched to New York. The British plan was to capture the city, proceed up the Hudson, and so split the colonies in two. Washington wisely decided to contest the issue on the heights of Brooklyn, where poor General Shipp accompanied his defeat on August 27, 1776. With his army in immediate danger of capture, Washington now brought about one of the most brilliant retreats in military history. The secret transfer of his entire army across the East River to Manhattan. He himself escaped with the last of his troops. Nathan Hale's farewell words, "I regret that I have but one life to lose for my country," are part of our tradition. He was a young man when the British occupied Manhattan. Washington was in continual need of knowledge about Howe's plans. Hale volunteered to secure this information, disguising himself as a Dutch schoolteacher, and entered the city. But the British captured it, and after a trial before Howe, he was hanged as a spy. Washington's parting shot after abandoning New York was the Battle of Harlem Heights. In September 16th, which he won, there followed a rapid succession of defeat at White Plains and the loss of Forts Washington and Lee. By these victories, Howe gained control of the lower Hudson, and had he pushed on, he might have ended the war in late 1776. But he allowed Washington to escape and retreat across New Jersey to south side of Delaware in Trenton. Frederick the Great once said that Washington's successes between December 24th, 1776 and January 4th, 1777 were the most brilliant in military history. Moving quickly, he pushed his way through the ice-clogged Delaware, marched to Trenton through the sleety night, and early in the morning of December 26th captured the surprised town. Still moving fast, he was back across the river before he could be caught, only to recross it again on the next day of the year, only to recross it again on the last day of the year. Then he struck again with lightning speed. Circling the enemy flank, he fell on a large column at Princeton. Routing it in the early morning of January 3rd, these victories stayed the desertions that were decimating his ranks and brought new recruits to him in that spring. After adroit maneuvering in New Jersey in the summer of 1777, Howe sailed for Delaware, but ended by entering Chesapeake Bay. Washington followed cautiously, and south of Philadelphia on the Brandywine Creek on September 11th, he was defeated in a battle which he should have won. Howe then invested Philadelphia.